Self acceptance. How we all battle with our eternal selves. You see, the story of Shigeo Mob Kageyama is not just one of psychic battles and supernatural threats and cool visuals, which, trust me, amazing visuals. It's a deeply personal journey about self acceptance. You see, despite his immense powers, Mob's greatest conflict was with himself, rooted in fear, misunderstanding, and a desperate search for belonging. Ha, doesn't that sound very familiar to all of us? You see, his psychic abilities, far from being a gift, were a source of profound insecurity and internal struggle. And much of his journey revolved around coming to terms with his powers, his emotions, even, and ultimately his own identity. You see, one of the earliest and most pivotal events that shaped Mob's relationship with his powers was a traumatic incident from his childhood. While trying to protect his younger brother Ritsu from bullies, Mob's emotions boiled over, unleashing his psychic abilities in a destructive surge. In this chaos that followed, Mob believed that he had accidentally hurt Ritsu. He could not forgive himself from hurting his pride and joy, his little brother, the person that he loved and cherished so heavily. He could not believe that he had allowed himself to unleash this emotion, and he bottled this deep inside him. And this belief haunted him for years, embedding a deep fear of losing control. The thought that his power could harm the person he loved most made Mob suppress his emotions. A desperate attempt to avoid another outburst, he became afraid of himself, viewing his abilities as something dangerous and uncontrollable rather than as a part of who he was. The fear created a barrier between Mob and his own self acceptance. Rather than embracing his abilities and ultimately a massive, large part of himself, he rejected it, believing that they made him dangerous and undesirable and something of a monster. Mob longed to be normal, to live a life where his powers were unnecessary and irrelevant. His fear of hurting others, especially those close to him, made him retreat emotionally, and he came to view himself as weak despite his immense psychic potential and abilities. Mob's relationship with his younger brother also complicated his journey towards self acceptance. You see, Ritsu, unlike Mob, envied psychic abilities and resented his own lack of powers, while Mob saw his abilities as a burden. Ritsu saw them as something to aspire to. This stark contrast in how they viewed psychic power created a chasm between the brothers. Mob, unaware of Ritsu's envy, continued to struggle with guilt over the perceived injury he had caused in the past. And to top it off, Mob was jealous and not envious or jealous, actually, that's the wrong terminology. He was proud of his little brother, and he wished that he aspired to be like his younger brother. That's what he wanted to be. He aspired to be as strong as his younger brother. Well, Ritsu aspired to be as brave and as strong as his older brother with powers, right? It's interesting how each one had what the other sought so desperately, and neither could fully grasp it until much later. You see, Ritsu harbored feelings of inferiority, unable to understand why Mob didn't value the very thing he yearned from. It wasn't until much later that Ritsu clarified the truth that Mob hadn't harmed him during that fateful childhood incident. Ritsu had been unharmed by Mob's psychic explosion, but Mob's guilt had been eating away at him for years. This revelation was a significant moment for Mob, but it didn't immediately resolve his inner conflict. Though relieved, Mob was still burdened by the fear of his own power and the emotional repression that had come to define him. He had been doing this for so long, it became an innate part of himself. Amid this internal turmoil, Mob found unexpected sources of support. One of these was the Body Improvement Club, a group of physically strong but kind-hearted individuals. Mob's decision to join the club was not about gaining physical strength necessarily. It was about becoming someone he could respect, somebody whose body didn't crumble at every little activity. His frail body and psychic abilities were of no consequence to the club members, who valued Mob's determination to improve himself. That's all they cared about. They would lift him when he fell. They would fight for him when they felt they needed to. They embodied the idea that strength wasn't just about physical power, but about resilience and self-discipline, qualities that Mob desperately sought to cultivate within himself. Though Mob frequently lagged behind in training, the encouragement and acceptance, and the key word here is acceptance. Mob didn't really feel accepted, but the thing is, he was. He received acceptance from the club members, which gave him a sense of belonging and confidence, chipping away at his deeply ingrained self doubt. Dimple, the once evil spirit who sought to manipulate Mob for his own purposes, became another important influence on his journey. Though self serving at first, Dimple gradually shifted into a more complex role, offering guidance and insight. Dimple saw potential in Mob that Mob himself could not yet grasp. In his own strange way, Dimple encouraged Mob to explore his abilities rather than hide from them. While Dimple's motives were never entirely pure, his presence was crucial in helping Mob to begin to see his powers in a much different light. But perhaps the most, well, not perhaps, clearly the most influential figure in Mob's life was his mentor, Reigen Ataka. Reigen, a con artist who lacked any real psychic ability, nonetheless, became Mob's moral and emotional compass. Despite his flaws, Reigen was a master at understanding people, and he provided Mob with the emotional stability and validation he so desperately needed. Reigen constantly reminded Mob that his worth as a person was not tied to his abilities. In fact, he's the one that gave him the rule to not use that on any human ever, which was very important. And whenever Mob felt like he needed to and he was afraid to, Reigen said, "Give me your powers. You should not harm anybody. This is a responsibility for an adult to take." And he fought on behalf of Mob. Despite him being a con artist, the love he had for Mob was the biggest love. I think his favorite human on earth. At some point, he's the reason. Like, Mob was something that almost his own child, basically, right? I kind of stumbled there just because, man, I'm just thinking about the ending of Mob Psycho and how emotional it made me feel. So I got a little emotional talking about it. But he saw him like his own blood, fresh flesh and blood. And it's just beautiful. The relationship is my favorite thing about the whole show. Now, despite his flaws, Reigen was a master of understanding people. Reigen constantly reminded Mob that his worth as a person was way more beyond his abilities, but about his heart and actions. He taught Mob that strength did not come from his powers alone, but from his humanity and empathy. Reigen's guidance helped Mob navigate the murky waters of self-acceptance, giving him the emotional tools to stabilize his feelings and view himself more holistically. However, despite all the positive influences in life, Mob's struggle with self-acceptance persisted. His fear of losing control, of causing harm, remained a constant undercurrent in his life time and time again. Mob found himself at the brink of emotional collapse whenever he hit 100%. That's when that emotion spilled. Suppressing his feelings to avoid another explosion of psychic energy, his powers were tied to his emotion, and as long as he feared his emotion, he feared himself. No matter how many enemies he defeated or how he grew physically and emotionally, Mob still grappled with the core belief that he was a danger to others, that his powers made him something less than human. He was still just a child. Even when faced with overwhelming odds, Mob's greatest challenge was always internal. He could defeat every opponent immediately if he utilized all of his powers, but he never wanted to. He never wanted to fight. He didn't even want the goddamn powers. He just wanted to be a normal boy. The more he tried to suppress these emotions, the more they threatened to consume him. His powers, immense and unpredictable, reflected the depth of his emotional struggle. Mob's journey was not just about controlling his psychic abilities, it was about learning to accept his emotions and in turn accept himself. By the end of his journey, Mob began to understand that his powers were not something to be feared or rejected. They were a part of him, just as his emotions were. True self-acceptance required him to embrace both the light and the dark within himself, to acknowledge that his fears and insecurities without letting them define him. Mob's struggle for self-acceptance was long and arduous, but he was also deeply human. Have you ever struggled with self-acceptance, whether it was your look, how your face looked, or how your body looked, or if it was something emotional, how you reacted in situation? Have you ever struggled with self-acceptance? Because I think most of us have, right? By some degree, whether large, small, medium, you may not even be aware that right now you might be suffering from the same things Mob was. And it's not a battle that just ends. No, it's a battle that's continuous. But it's about understanding and accepting that it is a part of you. Those things that you may not like so much are a part of you. And certain things you can change and certain things you cannot change. And that, you just must accept that. Despite all of his psychic powers, Mob was just a boy trying to find his place in the world, still learning to accept himself for who he truly was. And in that struggle, he found a quiet strength that had nothing to do with psychic abilities, but everything to do with his heart. And as I say this, I hope I can be just like Mob at the end, accepting myself both negatively and positively. Embracing ourselves is key because how can somebody love you if you don't love yourself? Anyways, I'm out. It's a boy spiritual to God. Ah!